Most people can spot a Gulfstream or a Falcon from a mile away, but private aviation has a hidden layer most spotters never catch. If you like what we do here, hit subscribe now because this channel digs into aviation stories most others won't touch. Today, we're counting down 10 of the rarest private jets ever built. Number 1. Piaggio P180 Avanti. We're starting with a plane that isn't technically a jet at all, and that's exactly why it belongs on this list. The Piaggio P180 Avanti is a twin-engine turboprop out of Italy, but it flies faster than most light jets, cruising north of 400 miles per hour. That's the whole point of its bizarre design. Look at it and you'll notice something's off. The wing sits way back near the tail. There's a small extra wing up front called a canard, and the propellers push instead of pull. 3 lifting surfaces, pusher propellers mounted behind the cabin. Pilots who fly it will tell you the cabin is almost silent compared to anything else in its class, because the props sit behind the passengers instead of in front of them. Piaggio built this thing in the 1980s, hoping to outfly the business jets of the era without burning jet fuel prices. It worked technically, it just never sold in big numbers. Fewer than 300 have ever rolled off the line in over 3 decades of production, and most Americans have never laid eyes on one outside a handful of corporate airports. If you've seen one taxiing at a regional field, you were one of the lucky few. Number 2. Eclipse 500. Now we go from a plane that succeeded quietly to one that tried to change the entire industry and nearly took itself down in the process. The Eclipse 500 was supposed to be the jet that made private flying affordable for regular business owners, not just billionaires. Eclipse Aviation launched in the late 1990s with a promise that sounded almost too good. A twin-engine jet priced under $1 million when comparable jets cost 5 times that. They pioneered something called the very light jet category. Small, efficient twin jets built with friction stir welding instead of traditional riveting, a manufacturing trick borrowed from the space industry to cut weight and cost. For a while, it actually worked. Orders poured in, then production delays, cost overruns, and the 2008 financial collapse hit at the worst possible moment. Eclipse Aviation filed for bankruptcy that same year, restarted under new ownership, and filed again in 2009. Roughly 260 aircraft were built before the whole operation came apart, and a huge share of them are still flying today, quietly, in the hands of private owners who know exactly what they're sitting in. Most people on a runway wouldn't recognize one if it taxied right past them. Number 3. Atom A700 Atom Jet. If the Eclipse story sounds rough, the Atom A700 makes it look like a triumph. This is one of the strangest looking business jets ever certified, and almost nobody outside the industry has ever heard of it. Atom Aircraft designed the A700 with twin tail booms, a shape that looks more like a World War II fighter than a modern business jet, because the company built it off the bones of their earlier piston-powered A500. 2 Williams FJ33 engines mounted on the fuselage, a pressurized cabin, and a price tag aimed squarely at the same very light jet market Eclipse was chasing. The company ran out of money before the dream ever got off the ground commercially. Atom Aircraft filed for bankruptcy in February 2008, just months after the A700 received its type certification. Depending on which count you trust, somewhere between 3 and 7 aircraft were ever completed before the doors closed for good. That makes this one of the rarest certified business jets in existence. If you ever spot one in a museum or a private hangar, you're looking at a piece of aviation that almost nobody else on Earth has seen with their own eyes. 4. Honda HA420 HondaJet Elite. Here's one that surprises people for a completely different reason. Most Americans know Honda for cars, motorcycles, maybe lawnmowers. Almost nobody expects Honda to build one of the most technically radical business jets flying today. The HondaJet's signature feature sits right on top of the wing, not underneath it. Honda mounted the engines above the wings instead of on the fuselage or beneath the wing like every other manufacturer. That single decision, engineers will tell you, reduces drag, frees up cabin space, and improves fuel efficiency in ways that took Honda nearly 3 decades of research to perfect, starting all the way back in the early 1990s. It's not rare in the sense of low production numbers. HondaJet has actually become one of the best-selling light jets in the world since certification in 2015. It's rare in a different way way. Most people have simply never connected the dots that the same company building your Civic also builds one of the most advanced private jets in the sky. Next time you see that swept-wing silhouette with engines perched above the wing, you'll know exactly what you're looking at. Number 4. Honda HA420 HondaJet Elite. Here's one that surprises people for a completely different reason. Most Americans know Honda for cars, motorcycles, maybe lawnmowers. Almost nobody expects Honda to build one of the most technically radical business jets flying today. The HondaJet's signature feature sits right on top of the wing, not underneath it. Honda mounted the engines above the wings instead of on the fuselage or beneath the wing like every other manufacturer. That single decision, engineers will tell you, reduces drag, frees up cabin space, and improves fuel efficiency in ways that took Honda nearly 3 decades of research to perfect, starting all the way back in the early 1990s. It's not rare in the sense of low production numbers. HondaJet has actually become one of the best-selling light jets in the world since certification in 2015. It's rare in a different way. Most people have simply never connected the dots that the same company building your Civic also builds one of the most advanced private jets in the sky. Next time you see that swept-wing silhouette with engines perched above the wing, you'll know exactly what you're looking at. Number 5. Sukhoi Business Jet. This next one barely counts as a real aircraft, and that's exactly why it belongs here. The Sukhoi Business Jet, sometimes shortened to SBJ, was Russia's attempt to take the Superjet 100 regional airliner and shrink it down into a long-range luxury business jet for the global elite. On paper, it looked serious. Sukhoi partnered with Italian aerospace giant Leonardo, formerly Finmeccanica, to develop a version of the Superjet with a redesigned cabin, extended range, and the kind of interior fit-out that could compete with Gulfstream and Bombardier. The project was unveiled at business aviation trade shows with real mock-ups, real marketing, and real ambition. It never went anywhere. Sanctions, funding problems, and a business jet market that never warmed up to a Russian-built option meant the SBJ stayed a concept. No production units were ever delivered to a private customer. In a way, it's the rarest jet on this entire list because, technically speaking, you've never seen one flying, and neither has almost anyone else alive today. Number 6. Dassault Falcon 7X. The Falcon 7X isn't rare because so few were built. Over 250 have rolled off Dassault's assembly line since the aircraft entered service back in 2007, and production continued for more than a decade after that. It's rare in a different sense entirely because almost nobody outside the ultra-wealthy circle has ever actually set foot inside one, and most people watching this couldn't pick it out of a lineup of business jets even if their life depended on it. It simply doesn't cross paths with ordinary air travelers. Dassault built the 7X as their flagship, and it holds a genuinely important place in aviation engineering history. It was the first business jet ever designed almost entirely around digital fly-by-wire flight controls, a technology borrowed directly from Dassault's military fighter programs, specifically the design philosophy behind the Rafale. Instead of traditional mechanical linkages connecting the pilot's controls to the control surfaces, computers interpret every input and adjust the aircraft automatically for smoother, safer handling. At the time it launched, that level of fighter jet technology simply didn't exist anywhere else in civilian business aviation. 3 engines instead of 2 is another detail that catches people off guard, especially since most modern jets have moved toward twin-engine efficiency. But that tri-jet layout isn't outdated thinking. It's a deliberate choice that lets the 7X take off from short, high-altitude runways that would strand a twin-engine jet on the tarmac entirely. Aspen, Colorado is the textbook example pilots bring up constantly, a notoriously tricky mountain airport where thinner air and a short runway punish underpowered aircraft. The 7X handles it without breaking a sweat, which is exactly why it became the preferred aircraft for owners who split their time between ski resorts, private islands, and remote estates that ordinary jets simply can't reach. Inside, the cabin stretches over 39 feet, giving Dassault's designers enough room to build 3 completely separate living zones instead of one long tube of identical seats. A private office up front for calls and work, a central lounge for meetings or dining, and a bedroom suite in the rear for long-haul flights across oceans. This is exactly the kind of layout you'd expect from a jet that regularly shows up on the tarmac at Davos during the World Economic Forum or parked quietly outside Cannes during festival season, invisible to the crowds walking the red carpet a few miles away. Base price when new set north of $50 million, and that number climbs fast once an owner starts customizing the interior. Some completions have run into the tens of millions on top of the base airframe cost alone, covering custom cabinetry, bespoke leather, and personalized electronic systems built to each buyer's exact specifications. It's a plane you've almost certainly seen in photographs without ever realizing what you are actually looking at, because the ultra-rich who fly it go out of their way to avoid cameras, routing through private terminals specifically built to keep prying eyes away. Number 7. Dassault Falcon 50. Go back one generation earlier than the 7X, and you land on the Falcon 50, the aircraft that quietly built Dassault's entire reputation in the American market decades before most people had ever even heard the brand name. Production ran from 1979 all the way through 2008, nearly 350 units built across that stretch, and yet this jet almost never crosses into public awareness unless something goes seriously wrong or a famous name is attached to it. The Falcon 50 mattered historically because it was the first business jet capable of true intercontinental range without stopping to refuel, connecting cities like New York and Paris non-stop in a purely private aircraft, a capability that simply hadn't existed in that category before its arrival. That range came from the same Triget layout as its successor, 3 engines mounted with 2 on the rear fuselage and 1 buried in the tail, giving it both the fuel efficiency for long crossings and the short runway, high-altitude performance that became Dassault's signature calling card among serious operators. Here's where casual aviation fans actually recognize the name without realizing it. A Falcon 50 carried Michael Jackson's body from Los Angeles back to the East Coast following his death in 2009, and that single somber moment put more public eyes on this aircraft than 3 decades of quiet corporate service ever managed to. Outside of that one widely covered flight, the Falcon 50 lived its entire operational life as the discreet workhorse of old money families, oil executives, and foreign government officials who valued range and mechanical reliability over flash or top-end speed. Cabin layout on the Falcon 50 was considered generous for its era, seating for up to 9 passengers in a configuration that emphasized comfort over raw capacity. With a baggage compartment accessible in flight, a detail business travelers of the era genuinely valued on long transatlantic legs. Avionics packages varied wildly depending on when each individual aircraft was built and subsequently upgraded, since many Falcon 50s flying today have had their original 1980s cockpit instruments completely replaced with modern digital displays decades into their service life, extending their usefulness well beyond what Dassault's original engineers likely expected. Most surviving Falcon 50s are pushing 40 to 45 years old at this point, and yet a significant number remain in active private and corporate service today, still flying, still privately owned, and still completely invisible to anyone who doesn't already know precisely what to look for parked on a quiet corner of the ramp. Maintenance costs on an airframe this old aren't cheap, but for owners who already have the infrastructure and mechanics in place, keeping a Falcon 50 airworthy remains far more economical than trading into something newer. Number 8. Lockheed JetStar. Now we go back to the very beginning, because the JetStar is where the entire concept of the private business jet actually started. Lockheed rolled this aircraft out in 1957, originally designed to fulfill a United States Air Force requirement for a utility transport aircraft, and in the process it became the first purpose-built business jet in aviation history, arriving years before Learjet or Gulfstream even existed as competing manufacturers in the space. The JetStar looks nothing like a modern business jet, and that unfamiliar silhouette is exactly why it's so rarely spotted or recognized today. 4 engines mounted in pairs on the rear fuselage, a design choice almost nobody uses anymore since twin-engine jets eventually proved just as safe while burning dramatically less fuel. Distinctive underwing fuel tanks give it a profile that reads closer to a small airliner than anything resembling a modern private jet, a look that was cutting edge in the late 1950s and now feels like a relic from an entirely different era of aviation. Lockheed built roughly 200 examples between 1957 and 1978, split between military utility and transport roles and genuine civilian VIP configurations for corporations and wealthy private owners. Sinatra had one. So did Elvis Presley, who famously owned a JetStar, named it Hound Dog 2, and it remains preserved on public display at Graceland to this day, one of the very few surviving JetStars the general public can actually walk right up to and see with their own eyes, rather than glimpsing one from behind an airport fence. Almost every other surviving JetStar today sits in private hands, engines, tucked away in museum storage collections, or has been scrapped outright over the decades because parts support for a nearly 70-year-old four-engine jet has become brutally expensive to source and maintain. Specialized mechanics familiar with engines this old are increasingly hard to find, and insurance costs on an aircraft this dated can price out all but the most committed collectors and aviation enthusiasts. If you've ever wondered what a private jet actually looked like before private jet became its own recognizable category, this is it, the true origin point of an entire industry. Number 9. Gulfstream G550. The G550 earns its place on this list for a different reason than everything else we've covered so far. It isn't obscure in terms of production numbers or industry importance, it's simply almost never actually seen by the general public despite being one of the most influential business jets ever manufactured. Gulfstream introduced the G550 in 2003 as the successor to the highly respected GV, and it went on to become the benchmark every other manufacturer measured themselves against for nearly 2 decades of continuous production. Range is the number that matters most here. Over 6,750 nautical miles on a single tank, enough capability to connect Los Angeles to Tokyo or New York to Dubai without ever stopping to refuel along the way. That kind of intercontinental reach turned the G550 into the preferred aircraft for heads of state, billionaires, and notably, several intelligence and military special mission variants that the United States government still operates today under entirely different designations, stripped of any visible Gulfstream branding whatsoever to keep their true purpose discreet. Over 500 units were built before Gulfstream officially ended G550 production in 2021 to shift focus toward the newer G600 and G700 platforms. But here's the part that keeps it genuinely rare. In practical, real-world terms, the examples that matter most to their owners almost never land at commercial airports where the general public could photograph or even notice them. Owners and flight departments deliberately route these aircraft into private fixed-base operators specifically designed to avoid public terminals entirely, meaning that despite being one of the single most significant business jets of the entire 21st century, the average person has, statistically speaking, never actually stood close enough to see one in person with their own eyes. Number 10. Bombardier Learjet 28. We're closing this list with the aircraft family that made the word Learjet a household name across America, and yet almost nobody today can accurately describe what one actually looks like or when it was originally built. The earliest Learjet models trace directly back to founder Bill Lear himself in 1963, based on a Swiss-designed airframe originally developed for a fighter jet project, and that fighter jet DNA is precisely why early Learjets look so aggressive compared to the boxier, more conservative business jets that followed them onto the market. The narrow fuselage, the small oval windows, the sharply swept wings, every element of the design came from a philosophy built for raw speed first and cabin comfort a distant second consideration. Early Learjets cruised faster than nearly anything else in business aviation for over a decade straight, a reputation the brand rode so hard and so successfully that Learjet eventually became the generic term ordinary people used for any private jet whatsoever. The exact same way, Kleenex completely replaced the word tissue in everyday conversation. Production of the earliest Learjet variants numbered only in the low hundreds combined across all early models, and most surviving examples today sit quietly in museums, private aviation collections, or aircraft boneyards rather than active corporate fleets, having been replaced decades ago by larger, more comfortable, and more fuel-efficient successor models. It's the aircraft that effectively started an entire industry's grip on the public imagination, and it's exactly the plane almost nobody alive today has actually stood next to, despite instantly recognizing its name.